There are cases that terrify people because of their violence. There are cases that enrage the public because of their cruelty. But there are also cases that leave behind a very different feeling, a chill that creeps in from the inside. No noise, no chase, just one small sentence. A sentence light enough to be dismissed as a complaint, yet heavy enough to end a human life. That night, in a wide, dark parking lot, under the pale yellow lights of a supermarket, two people sat inside a car. No one knew who they were. No one paid attention. A simple meal, half-eaten pizza, cheap wine, ordinary details of everyday American life. And then, a sentence was spoken. I want to die. It did not sound like a cry for help. It did not scream. It drifted out slowly, calmly, as if it had been repeated too many times already. Inside the speaker's mind, across from him sat a woman shaped by war, violence, and years of prolonged trauma. And in that fragile moment caught between compassion and distortion, between empathy and a desperate need to feel needed, she replied, "I will, if you truly want me to." There was no thunder, no warning sign. Yet in that very second, the fate of two human beings turned onto a path with no return. Because in human life, some words are more than sound. They are commands. They are promises. They are excuses. And sometimes, they are a death sentence spoken in silence. This case did not begin with hatred. It did not begin with rage. It began with loneliness, with old wounds that were never healed, with the mistaken belief that love can redeem everything. And for that very reason, it became more dangerous than any sudden act of violence. This is the story of Lindsay Haugen, the woman who strangled her boyfriend to death. And it is also the story of Robert Mast, the man who said he no longer wanted to live. But deeper than that, it is a story about the things society often overlooks, the sighs no one hears, the trauma that is minimized, the people who appear ordinary, yet are slowly slipping over the edge without anyone noticing. When a sentence is spoken at the weakest moment of a life, it can become a plea for help or the spark of a tragedy. And when no one stops to listen, to question, to intervene, the consequence is not just one death. It is the collapse of many lives at once. This is not a story meant for instant judgment. It is a story that must be told slowly, heard fully, because if you have ever believed that words cannot kill, this case will force you to think again. When you first see Lindsay, you probably would not imagine that she once fired weapons from a Black Hawk helicopter. She carries a look of resilience, but beneath it lies exhaustion, trauma, a long history of being knocked down with no one there to catch her. Lindsay Haugen, a former National Guard sergeant, 10 years in the military, a woman respected in a world of iron discipline. But once the uniform came off, she returned to being an ordinary human being with a past that was never healed. Abused by her own father as a child, assaulted by a gang as a teenager, beaten, raped, pushed into water, and left unconscious by her fiancé. And tragically, she learned how to survive all of it without ever crying out for help. On the other side was Robert Glenn Mast, 25 years old. A man with an adventurous spirit, unwilling to live by templates, unable to stay in one place for long. Mast worked odd jobs, drifting from one state to another. Those who loved him described him as different, but kind, deeply loving. And even while facing bouts of depression, Mast knew how to seek help. He had plans to return to an ex-girlfriend in Minnesota. Someone was waiting for him. A future was waiting for him. A life he had not yet had the chance to fully live. Lindsay and Mast met like two weary sparks on a cold, windy night. They had known each other for less than a month, yet in that brief time, they shared stories few people dare to tell. Mast spoke about depression, about wanting to disappear. Lindsay spoke about survival, about the cost of loving the wrong person. They were not just a passing couple. They were two lonely people who found each other at life's breaking point. They ate pizza in a car, drank cheap wine, laughed, talked about pain. To the outside world, the relationship may not have seemed deep, but to those who have known suffering, having someone willing to sit and listen through a dark night can feel like intimacy. And perhaps that is why, when Mass said he wanted to die, Lindsay did not hear it as despair. She heard it as a request. A woman, long shaped by fear, now guided by a distorted belief in sacrifice, a form of love that was unhealthy, yet deeply real. Those two people, those two very different fates, stepped into that car like pieces that seemed to fit. But when pain goes unhealed, it does not bring understanding. It pulls people downward together, slowly, without escape. This is not simply the story of one who killed and one who died. It is the story of two people who only wanted to be heard, to be trusted, to be loved. But no one ever taught them how to love in a healthy way. And in the end, the fragile understanding between two wounded souls created a tragedy from which neither could turn back. 28 days. Not long enough to truly know another person, but long enough for two lonely souls to believe they had found shelter. Lindsay and Mast entered the relationship like people exhausted from walking too long in the dark. They did not ask many questions about tomorrow. They talked more about sadness, about sleepless nights, about the feeling of waking up with nothing left to look forward to. In the beginning, everything moved very fast. Fast in the way people love when they feel they have nothing left to lose. They drove across multiple states, slept in the car, ate whatever they could, listened to old music on the radio. America stretched beyond the windshield like a slow-moving film. For Mast, it felt like one last taste of freedom. For Lindsay, it was the first time someone truly listened to her without judgment. They spoke about depression as if it were a familiar companion. Mast admitted there were mornings when he woke up disappointed that he was still alive. Lindsay did not panic when she heard this. She had heard worse. She had survived things that once felt impossible, and because of that, she believed she understood. Enough patience. Any darkness could be overcome, but understanding is not the same as healing, and love is not always salvation. During those 28 days, they drank more than they were sober. Their deepest conversations often happened when alcohol blurred the boundaries of reason. Promises were made in moments of emotion. Vague plans for the future were sketched without any foundation. Mast had plans to return to Minnesota. Someone was waiting for him there. But Lindsay did not fully know this. Or perhaps she did, but did not dare to ask. Because asking meant facing the risk of losing him. And Mast, in the grip of depression, found in Lindsay someone willing to stay. Someone who did not demand that he be strong. Each of them saw in the other what they needed, not necessarily who the other truly was. The intensity of their relationship did not come from time. It came from absence. From the fact that both carried deep fractures and believed that if they pressed together, those cracks would somehow align. But broken pieces never form a solid foundation. They only cover the emptiness for a while. In modern culture, people have grown used to relationships that begin quickly and end just as fast. But when personal pain remains unresolved, that speed becomes dangerous. It creates the illusion of intimacy, the illusion that being understood by one person is enough, the illusion that love can replace therapy, replace time, replace the intervention that is truly needed. 28 days passed like a single breath. Not enough to love in a healthy way, but enough for both to believe they were no longer alone. And it was that fragile belief that led them to the night of fate where a sentence was spoken, and no one realized in time that they were crossing the final line between love and destruction. Billings at night is quiet, a small city resting under long stretches of yellow light across wide, empty parking lots. The early autumn wind was gentle, cold enough to make people pull their collars higher, but not cold enough to send them home. That night, Lindsay and Mast pulled into the parking lot of a Walmart. An ordinary stop. Too ordinary to become the place where a life would end. Inside the car was the smell of freshly bought pizza, its richness slowly fading as it cooled. A cheap bottle of wine sat between the seats. They ate slowly, drank slowly. No one was in a hurry. The radio played familiar songs, the background noise of American life, just enough to fill the silence, but not enough to hide the emptiness inside two people. Mass stared out through the windshield. The lights reflected across his face, revealing a deep exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from a long journey, but the kind that comes from living. He had spoken about it before, many times. But that night, the words were no longer casual complaints. He said he did not want to live anymore. His voice was even. No tears, no trembling, as if he were talking about the weather. For many people, that would have been the moment to call for help, to stop, to reach for another hand. But for Lindsay, the sentence touched something far deeper, a place shaped by abandonment, by control, by years of learning that love meant enduring, obeying, proving oneself through sacrifice. She looked at Mast and did not see a stranger. Perhaps in the wrong way, but still, someone in need. Under the parking lot lights, amid the smell of cooling pizza and the trace of wine on their lips, Lindsay replied, "I will. If you truly want me to." The sentence did not sound like a threat. It was soft, slow, almost gentle. And it was that gentleness that made it terrifying. Perhaps Mass never believed his words would be taken literally. Perhaps he was only searching for a reaction, an embrace, a reason to be held back. But in that moment, neither of them stopped to ask another question. No one checked the boundary. No one pulled the brake. Two people, each carrying a different kind of pain, unknowingly agreed to step into each other's darkest place. The night in Billings remained quiet. Cars came and went through the parking lot. Late-night shoppers had no idea that just a few meters away, a decision was taking shape. Not out of anger, not out of hatred, but out of confusion between love and sacrifice, between empathy and submission. In everyday life, pizza and wine symbolize relaxation, easy conversation. But that night, they became the backdrop for a proposal that should never have been accepted. And once the words were spoken, the fate of both lives quietly shifted onto another path. No alarms, no warning signs, only a long, heavy silence, foretelling what could no longer be undone. That moment did not arrive with a scream. It arrived in silence, a pause stretched between two breaths. Inside the car parked in the dark lot, Lindsay and Mast looked at each other. There were no more reassurances, no more questions, only a suspended feeling, as if both were standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure how to step back. Lindsay later said she felt detached from reality, as though she were watching everything through frosted glass. Many trauma survivors describe this sensation when the body takes over for the mind, when old memories rise and begin to steer behavior. For Lindsay, those memories were years of being controlled, of complying in order to be loved, to stay safe. And in that moment, a thought surfaced. I want to try killing someone too. It was not spoken as a boast. It was not bravado. It was a raw confession of the chaos unfolding inside her. Mast did not react strongly. He was quiet. Perhaps he did not believe her. Perhaps he thought it was only words. Perhaps he was still waiting for a hug, for reassurance. But that silence was not consent. It was the disorientation of a man so exhausted he could no longer respond correctly. And that silence was misread. What happened next did not unfold in seconds. It lasted, long enough for reason to intervene, long enough for someone to stop. But it did not happen. Not because of rage, not because of hatred, but because of a mental paralysis, a state in which time no longer feels normal, where each second drifts by, blurred and disconnected. Later, experts would point to this as the critical moment. Not the initial words, but the duration of the act. Because duration suggests intent still present, even when clouded by disorder, even when wrapped in emotional explanations. The law looks at time. Forensics look at evidence. And both lead to the same cold conclusion. This was not an accident. This was a decision that was not stopped. When it was over, there was no sense of triumph, no release, only a larger emptiness than before, a silence so heavy it could not be filled. Lindsay said she realized she had gone too far, that what had just happened was not love. But realization cannot reverse time. The moment of the crime was not a sudden explosion. It was a chain of choices left unchecked, a sentence never questioned, an action never interrupted. And in human life, the greatest tragedies do not always come from obvious evil. They come from confusion, between empathy and submission, between sacrifice and destruction. When that boundary is erased, all it takes is one sentence and one decision to take everything away. When Robert Mast's body was brought into the examination room, there was no longer space for emotion, no space for stories. Here, there was only truth, cold, precise, and incapable of lying. Under the harsh white lights, forensic pathologists began their work, where every bruise and every abrasion became a voice. The first evidence was found on the neck. Uneven bruising, clearly shaped like an adult hand. This was not a brief squeeze, not a sudden, impulsive act. It was sustained pressure, strong enough to rupture capillaries beneath the skin. Under microscopic analysis, the tissue cells showed a biological response from a living body fighting, struggling, losing oxygen moment by moment. Mast's lungs contained fluid, not a large amount, but enough to prove that he was breathing during the strangulation. That meant death did not come instantly. It unfolded over time, minutes, perhaps longer. In scientific terms, that is a long window, long enough for a decision to change, long enough to stop, but it did not happen. Beneath Mast's fingernails, experts found foreign skin cells, a clear sign of resistance, not consent, not surrender. The human body has a powerful survival instinct, and Mast tried to live, even in his final moments. This evidence directly contradicted the claim that he willingly chose to die. Time became the central factor. According to forensic analysis, the process leading to death lasted close to 20 minutes. 20 minutes is not a moment of lost control. It is a span of time in which the brain remains active, consciousness persists, and every passing second represents a choice. Forensic science does not weigh emotions. It reads the biological clock. And that clock revealed what no statement could conceal. There were no signs of alcohol levels high enough to cause complete loss of consciousness. Mast was not intoxicated to the point of being unaware of what was happening. Lindsay, according to toxicology results, was also not cognitively impaired. This ruled out the possibility that the act occurred in a state of uncontrollable delirium. When the forensic reports were placed on the investigator's table, the color of the case began to change. What had once sounded like a story of distorted love shifted into a harsher reality. A deliberate act. A process that was not interrupted. And a death far from the gentle version initially described. Later, in the courtroom, those dry numbers would be read aloud: heart rate, oxygen levels, duration of oxygen deprivation. But behind every number was a human being struggling to live, and another who did not stop. Forensic science does not deliver judgment through emotion. Yet it is precisely this emotional absence that makes the truth more painful, because it forces everyone to face what cannot be denied. In those 20 minutes, it was not only death that was unfolding. There was also a chance to save a life, a chance that was not taken. And from that moment on, the story no longer belonged to anyone's words. It belonged to the truth, unchangeable and irreversible. When police arrived at the scene, none of them knew they were about to step into one of the most strange and contradictory cases they would ever handle. Inside the car lay the motionless body of a young man, In the driver's seat sat a woman in tears, her lips trembling from cold and shock. At first glance, everything seemed straightforward, but as the first statements were given, that sense of clarity quickly unraveled. Lindsay stated that she had killed the man at his own request. Under the dim lights of a supermarket parking lot, even though the words came out hoarse, spoken through hollow eyes, they stunned the investigators. But police cannot rely on emotion. They need data. They need evidence. And piece by piece, a much larger picture began to emerge. Inside the vehicle, officers found a partially consumed bottle of wine, pizza boxes still warm, the victim's phone, scratches on his neck, and dried white foam around his mouth. These details supported parts of Lindsay's account, but at the same time, they raised far more troubling questions. If he truly wanted to die, why were there signs of resistance? Why were there indications of a struggle? Why did the death take as long as 20 minutes? This was not a split-second loss of control. Why did the death take as loss of control? It was a process. A sequence of actions involving time, choices, and continuation. A timeline was reconstructed. September 15, late afternoon. They stopped at Walmart, bought pizza, picked up wine, sat in the car, talked. Whatever was said in that moment, no one but the two of them heard. And then, within less than an hour, a life ended. Security cameras showed both of them inside the store. No visible tension, no argument, no raised voices. They appeared like two people enjoying an ordinary evening. They even smiled. This only deepened investigators' confusion, because the tragedy to come left no trace in those images. Everything that mattered happened later, inside the car, beyond the view of anyone else. And that unseen space is what made the case so dark. When asked why she did not call emergency services immediately, that she believed things could still be reversed. But forensic evidence showed that the victim had been dead for some time before medical personnel arrived. His lungs no longer responded. His heart had stopped at least 30 minutes earlier, which meant that if there was a moment when fate could have been changed, that moment had already passed. Investigators dug deeper into their relationship, into the brief but intense 28 days, into text messages and phone calls. There were no signs of abuse, no evidence of escalating conflict, but there was also no clear proof that Mast truly wanted to die. And according to his family, he was someone who faced depression by seeking help, not by giving up. Then another statement from Lindsay surfaced. She said she had previously thought about killing someone, that she had always wanted to know what it felt like to take a life with her bare hands. A confession that shifted the entire direction of the case. This was no longer an act of love, no longer assisted suicide. It suggested initiative, a desire hidden beneath the language of emotion. When weighed side by side, on one side, a short-lived love and an ambiguous request from the victim. On the other, Lindsay's own expressed desire to kill the investigators understood that this case would not end simply, because behind that death was a world of complexity, psychology, emotion, trauma, and the darkness that can exist within the human mind. From this point on, the case was no longer just a report. It became a journey into the human psyche, where love and killing can stand frighteningly close together, and where truth is as fragile as the line between compassion and irreversible harm. When Robert Mast's body was brought into the examination room, there was no longer space for emotion, no space for stories. Here, there was only truth, cold, precise, and incapable of lying. Under the harsh white lights, forensic pathologists began their work, where every bruise and every abrasion became a voice. The first evidence was found on the neck. Uneven bruising, clearly shaped like an adult hand. This was not a brief squeeze, not a sudden, impulsive act. It was sustained pressure, strong enough to rupture capillaries beneath the skin. Under microscopic analysis, the tissue cells showed a biological response from a living body fighting, struggling, losing oxygen moment by moment. Mast's lungs contained fluid. Not a large amount, but enough to prove that he was breathing during the strangulation. That meant death did not come instantly. It unfolded over time, minutes, perhaps longer. In scientific terms, that is a long window. Long enough for a decision to change, long enough to stop, but it did not happen. Beneath Mast's fingernails, experts found foreign skin cells, a clear sign of resistance, not consent, not surrender. The human body has a powerful survival instinct. And Mast tried to live, even in his final moments. This evidence directly contradicted the claim that he willingly chose to die. Time became the central factor. According to forensic analysis, the process leading to death lasted close to 20 minutes. 20 minutes is not a moment of lost control. It is a span of time in which the brain remains active, consciousness persists, and every passing second represents a choice. Forensic science does not weigh emotions. It reads the biological clock. And that clock revealed what no statement could conceal. There were no signs of alcohol levels high enough to cause complete loss of consciousness. Mast was not intoxicated to the point of being unaware of what was happening. Lindsay, according to toxicology results, was also not cognitively impaired. This ruled out the possibility that the act occurred in a state of uncontrollable delirium. When the forensic reports were placed on the investigator's table, the color of the case began to change. What had once sounded like a story of distorted love shifted into a harsher reality. A deliberate act. A process that was not interrupted. And a death far from the gentle version initially described. Later, in the courtroom, those dry numbers would be read aloud: heart rate, oxygen levels, duration of oxygen deprivation. But behind every number was a human being struggling to live, and another who did not stop. Forensic science does not deliver judgment through emotion. Yet it is precisely this emotional absence that makes the truth more painful, because it forces everyone to face what cannot be denied. In those 20 minutes, it was not only death that was unfolding. There was also a chance to save a life, a chance that was not taken. And from that moment on, the story no longer belonged to anyone's words. It belonged to the truth, unchangeable and irreversible. The Yellowstone County courtroom was heavy with silence that morning, not the kind born of argument or confrontation, but a deeper weight because everyone understood that no matter what was said, a life had already been lost, and no sentence could ever change that. Lindsay Haugen entered the courtroom wearing a light blue jail uniform. Gone was the image of a strong former service member. What remained was a thin woman with tired eyes, standing before a justice system she knew she could not escape. When questioned, her answers were brief. Yes. No. Her voice was flat. No excuses. No tears. No pleas for mercy. As if she already knew that words no longer mattered. She pleaded guilty to intentional homicide. The decision surprised many, not because the evidence was unclear, but because she made no attempt to deny responsibility. In her final statement, Lindsay admitted that what she had done was wrong. She said she deserved whatever sentence the court imposed, because nothing could bring Robert back. The words were spoken without drama, yet they were enough to make many in the courtroom lower their heads. Across the room, Robert Mast's family sat in silence. His stepmother, who had raised him since he was 2 years old, stood to speak. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. She spoke of a boy who loved adventure, a son with a warm heart, a man who was deeply loved. She emphasized that Robert was not someone who wanted to die, that when he struggled with depression he sought help, and that his trust had been betrayed. That, she said, was what truly killed him. The defense presented arguments centered on Lindsay's history of abuse, her post-traumatic stress disorder, a life shaped by violence, lived within violence, and conditioned to equate love with submission. They did not deny the killing, but they asked the court to see the human being behind the crime, a severely traumatized woman acting from a distorted psychological state. The prosecution pushed back forcefully. They stated there was no evidence that Robert had ever abused Lindsay. No evidence that this was self-defense or assisted suicide. The forensic findings showed that the victim resisted, that the death took time, that the defendant had ample opportunity to stop. In their view, this was not an unavoidable tragedy. It was a choice that was carried through to the end. The judge listened to everything, every word, every argument, and when he finally delivered the sentence, the courtroom held its breath. 60 years in prison, no early parole, no leniency, a sentence that sat between the maximum penalty and consideration of mitigating factors, severe enough to affirm responsibility, cold enough to underscore that human life is a boundary that cannot be crossed. Lindsay nodded slightly as the sentence was read. No outburst, no collapse, just a small, quiet lowering of her head. The trial was over. But for those present that day, the emptiness lingered, because no one left the courtroom feeling victorious. Only a silent truth remained. When love is distorted by unhealed trauma, it can lead to decisions that cannot be undone. And the law, no matter how strict, can only close a case. It cannot close the pain of those left behind. The trial ended. But emotions didn't stop at the courtroom door. Outside, Robert's stepmother stood motionless for a long time, not with anger in her eyes, but with a quiet sorrow too deep to name. She had said everything that needed saying in the hearing, but no one can speak on behalf of a mother bearing the child she once held in her arms. For Lindsay, the handcuffs tightened like a circle closing in, from the battlefield of war to the battlefield of the mind, from childhood nightmares to a 60-year sentence. Everything was no longer speculation, but destiny. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. But her eyes said it all. They weren't the eyes of someone fighting back. They were the eyes of someone who finally understood she had lost her last chance to start over. Elsewhere, those who once knew Robert quietly hung his photo in their homes. They couldn't make it to Montana. But to them, Robert was never just a headline. He was someone who gave hugs when they were down, who told stories that made them laugh, and now, someone who reminded them how trusting the wrong person can be the last mistake you ever make. The sentence was read. Justice, by definition, was served. But human hearts are not files to be closed. On one side, irreparable loss. On the other, regret beyond repair. And in between, a society left asking how to heal a soul before it turns into a crime. After the trial, the story of Lindsay and Mast didn't end in a court file. It spilled into coffee shop conversations, into online comment sections, where one side labeled Lindsay a cold-blooded killer, and the other saw her as a casualty of wounds buried too deep for too long. Some asked, how could a woman once trusted as a military sergeant do such a thing? Others answered, this is what happens when we pat soldiers on the back, without ever asking what they've brought home in their hearts. Their story became a mirror, reflecting our biases about depression, about violence masked as love, about how easily we confuse trauma with justification. But it also whispered a warning about the breathless loneliness of modern life, because Lindsay and Mast were both people waiting to be heard, and no one listened long enough to hold them here, alive. No one was completely right. No one was entirely to blame. And public opinion is not justice. It only reflects how we choose to see a person from the outside. When sometimes, what matters most is simply looking deeper, touching honestly, before it's too late. Sometimes, the greatest tragedies don't begin with a gunshot, not with rage, but with a quiet sentence whispered in the dark, a moment of loneliness that no one reached. A tiny fracture in the soul that no one imagined could become the line between life and death. Maybe Lindsay was wrong. Maybe Mast had lost hope. But beneath it all were two human beings, searching for something to hold on to, a place without judgment, an embrace gentle enough to keep someone from falling. We are quick to judge, to condemn, to turn away. But there comes a time to ask ourselves, how many times have we ignored the small signals? from those beside us? How often have we missed the sadness behind a smile? How many people have slipped into silence simply because they didn't know how to ask for help? Lindsay can't go back. Mast won't get a second chance. But you can. We can. Each day is a choice. To listen or to turn away. To stay or to leave. To reach out or walk past. This story isn't just about Lindsay or Mast. It's about all of us. Because if a single sentence can end a life, then maybe a single sentence can save one too.